We read today from the letter of St. Peter the Apostle, chapter 4, and beginning with verse 1. Forasmuch then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, reveling, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you, who shall give an account to him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead. For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to man in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. Today throughout Christendom, many people celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are many in the religious world who have made this one of the primary festive days of their religious tradition. There are those who would not think of missing the passion of Good Friday or the joy of the resurrection of the early morning of the first day of the week. But many of these same people go through these ceremonies annually, as indeed often they go through the rest of their religious life ceremonially, bowed down with the same cares, the same anxieties, the same frustrations, the same defeat, and the same darkness as those of the pagan world. They wonder, for example, what are we going to do about chemical pollution of the environment? What are we going to do about the inevitable problem of world hunger? What are we going to do about the hovering cloud of nuclear war and annihilation? What are we going to do about the undisciplined drug generation? And even more particular and closer to home, what are we going to do about the deterioration of family life? What are we going to do about broken homes and children committing suicide at an alarming rate? And we could wax philosophical and we could talk about many things in this regard, but the thing I wish to point up is that apparently, in many instances, the religious tradition of Christendom has not provided the answers to the real problems of life. Oh, sure, it's a historic occasion in which we speak of the passion, the death, and the resurrection of the Savior. Certainly these religious occasions and liturgies mean something. In fact, in many instances, they mean much to the practitioners of the same. But it still doesn't answer the question of frustration, emptiness, unhappiness, the lack of purpose, and the lack of challenge in the individual life. More and more I am seeing in people who are old enough to know better, who have lived for a long time in what we like to call the fundamental faith, a disillusionment, a disappointment, a restlessness, a dissatisfaction with marriage, with lot in life, with achievement, that has been growing on them for years and is only following a few years behind the trends of the world. These are the real problems, and the religious liturgies and traditions of seasonal ceremonies don't seem to make many inroads into them. When Easter has come and gone, the problems and the restlessness and the disillusionment and the fear that those problems bring remain. And the question is, should this be this way? What has the Christian tradition of Easter got to offer us if it can't do anything about the problems of life? And how, in fact, from the biblical point of view, does the resurrection of Jesus Christ relate to these problems, or does it? In order to come to grips with the reality from the biblical point of view, from God's point of view, of the meaning of the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we must have some fundamental, foundational appraisal of the problems and why they exist. Or perhaps we could simplify that and say the problem. If we went back to the beginning of the human race, we would hear God saying to man in the Garden of Eden, "In the day you rebel against my law, you will surely die." And the law of God in that instance was a little more identifying, a little broader. In the day that you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and of evil, you will die. Now, of course, we in Christianity know that not only did man eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but God permitted it. He put it in the garden. He made it accessible. He did not lock it up with a chain. He didn't put a fence around it. He didn't put the cherubim around the tree as he later did at the gates of the garden to keep man away. Why was that? Because man was created a free moral agent. Man was created in the image of God. Man was created to be family to God. And God was faced with the puzzling paradox that every good parent is faced with. The one, the desire not to have children do anything harmful and destructive to themselves, and the other, the desire not to destroy that individual in the process of trying to protect him. God didn't want robots. He didn't want marionettes. He didn't want machines. If that's what God had wanted, that's what he would have made. He made instead man in his own image, warned him against the dangers, but provided him the opportunity to act and react and to express, because God knew that a man who did not have this choice, a man whose hands were tied so that he could not express this choice, wasn't worth having, and was certainly not what God envisioned when he created man in his own image. And so man decided to know good and evil by experience, and in so doing, he brought upon himself the inevitable hurt and the inevitable death and the inevitable suffering. And so God said, "You'll bear children out of agony. You'll make your living with the sweat of your face in a patch of thorns and thistles until you go back to the dust, because out of the dust you were taken, and to the dust you shall return." From that point on, the program of God, the redemptive purposes of God, and the biblical theme and story began to be this: how are we going to bring man back into the family of God? How are we going to provide him the means whereby we can preserve the free moral agency, preserve the whimsicalness and the willfulness of the man, not the machine, and at the same time eliminate the evil that is killing, destroying, disillusioning the human race? How are we going to do that? It isn't all as simple as is sometimes made out when you deal with the redemptive purposes of God through Jesus Christ. One of the central issues that we are faced with is that of justice and of righteousness. Whether we realize it or not, and in our antinomian, libertine society we probably don't, not even in the church, when justice and righteousness go down the drain, everything goes with it. First, you've got to have that which is fair, and you've got to have that which is right, and that which is good. You've got to start with that. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. And so the death, the suffering, the agony that man brought upon himself when he rebelled against God was inevitable. It was necessary. It is germane to the whole of life, every concept of life which has any meaning. There must be justice. There must be righteousness. There must be truth. There must be that which is sound and moral and good, and which preserves and which gives life. So whatever then that God would do for man had to include, would include, could not avoid the suffering in this mortal world, the judgment, the curse. Wayward man must suffer the judgment of God. Sometimes people say, well, I just really don't see from a theological point of view why that's necessary. Well, if we backed away from it and quit using the term theological to confuse ourselves, we could see it very easily. How do you feel, for example, when someone commits rape, murder, mayhem, and the courts slap his hands and turn him loose back into society to do the same thing over again? And many of us who do not think of ourselves as vindictive, mean, hard, cruel, unforgiving, unyielding, say, that man must pay. There's got to be justice. If there's not justice, it'll keep getting worse and worse and worse. You can't live in a society where crime is not punished. Well, human societies don't always do that, but God always does. And so the redemptive plan of God, and specifically now, as St. Peter is talking about our lives, and as we have been talking about our lives, involves life in this mortal world. Whatever we're going to find in God's truth, whatever we're going to find in the story of Christ and the incarnation and the resurrection, is going to involve the judgment of God upon the mortal in this world. You're not going to get out of the suffering of mortality. You're not going to get out of it. Many people have used the grace of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ as a cop-out, as an escapist philosophy. Here's a way that you can get out of the sufferings of mortality. Here's a way that you can beat the system. You can sign this card, you can come down to this altar, you can make this profession, and God will give you a free pass. Not so, my friend. Not so, not so, not so. Those who teach such a doctrine have misperceived the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Another thing that we are faced with when we talk about the redemptive purposes of God in this world was put into words by St. Paul in the 15th chapter of his 1 Corinthian letter when he said this. Listen to it carefully because it is so important. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. The first Adam, the second Adam, the first man, the second man, the new race of man, but nevertheless, man. By man came also the resurrection of the dead. The heart and soul of heresy in this world is to see Jesus Christ as neither all God nor all man. And equally, the heart and soul of Christian theology is this: to see Jesus Christ as all God and all man. If Jesus Christ wasn't all God and all man, then he was neither man nor God. Happily for the Christian church, Jesus Christ was all God and he was all man. And we are thinking now for the moment particularly about Christ, the man. By man came the resurrection of the dead. And so Jesus Christ underwent the incarnation. He was born. He was a babe. He was held at the breast. He grew up as a child. He grew in stature and in approval of God and man. He learned. He was a man. He came into this world and identified with the sins of the human race. He was baptized in the River Jordan. He identified with the temptations. He was in all points tempted like as we are. He was driven by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he was put to the test so far as temptations are concerned. This man came into the world as the second man, or the new man, the new race, to provide the answer to the human dilemma, to provide the solution to the death, the suffering, the dying, which encompasses all of these things that we have talked about: personal achievement, personal challenge, personal happiness, family life, children, the society, the environment, the hope of mankind. In order to do this, this man had to suffer as other men. He had to do it because it was the lot of man. In the day you eat, you shall die. You shall suffer. You shall suffer bringing children into the world. You shall suffer making your living. You shall suffer the pain and the indignity of dying. And so Jesus Christ, the man, in order to provide the great salvation, had to suffer. But there's another reason, other than justice, why Jesus Christ suffered. It is because the only way you can destroy a thing which is destroying you is to engage it in combat and overcome it. The problem was death. Now we may think that we can find a way around problems, but God knows that it doesn't work like that. You've got to meet the problem head on. You've got to overcome it. You've got to subdue it. You've got to destroy it before it ceases to be a problem. And in the second chapter of the book of Hebrews, it is put in this way: through death, he, Jesus Christ, destroyed him who had the power of death, and delivered them who all their lifetime, through fear of death, were subject to bondage. The only way the threat of death and the fear of death could be destroyed was for Christ to meet it head on. Now, in the Old Testament theology, Reformation was satisfactory. Christ could simply have come up against death in a moral force. He could have shamed it. He could have backed it off. He could have humiliated it. He could have discredited it. But you see, it would have still existed. The only way that Jesus Christ could destroy death was to die and to be resurrected, and in this way to shatter the bondage and the power of death. The only way he could destroy it was to undergo it and burst it apart. Christ died, and then he was resurrected, and in his resurrection, death lost its power. And the true Christian doctrine is this, that death no more has terror because death no more has power. Death, which in the Old Testament times was a sinister, feared monster, in the New Testament time is a doorway through which man passes from this limited experience, which he can't keep anyway, and if he understood properly he wouldn't want to keep, into something infinitely more beautiful, more rewarding, and more desirable. Jesus said, "Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone, but if it die, it bears much fruit." It's all around us in nature. You take a tiny little flower seed and put it in the ground, and it dies and decays, but it comes out of that grave in a new expression of life which is infinitely more beautiful because it is germinated with the spark of life, or a stalk of corn, or a tree, or grass, or whatever. Death, resurrection, new life, greater beauty, something more to be desired. And it was in this vein that Piers Plowman said, "Gentle brother death." The ancients reached for it when they wrote words such as the words of the great hymn, "This is not death's dark portal, life's golden gate to me. Link after link is broken, and I at last am free." The psalmist put it differently when he said, "The trap is broken, and the little bird has escaped and has flown away." But what all is involved in death? Is it just the body? Just the laying down in the grave and coming out again in the resurrection in the day of Jesus Christ? If that's all it was, it wouldn't take long to tell about it, and unhappily, it wouldn't mean much to us today in our lives. But that isn't all. Every inferior thing, every undesirable thing, every unhappy thing, every negative thing is a part of the curse of death. And God has provided a way through Jesus Christ's suffering and his resurrection for you and I to employ this principle of putting it in the ground and having it spring up again into something infinitely more beautiful. The curse of mortality, which is suffering and death with no hope, has been turned into a hopeful business by Jesus Christ, the second man, and his resurrection, because for those who are Christ, it has germinated our very being with the spark of life, so that everything we do for Christ, every suffering, every dying, is the means by which these little things of mortality, which we would lose anyway, can be turned into something eternal and infinitely more beautiful. We are, if you please, taking the seeds of our lives, once they have been germinated by the life that is in Christ, laying them down in the dust of death to take them up again in something eternal, lasting, and fulfilling. The physical resurrection is future. The day of the Lord will come. The Lord will descend from heaven with a shout. The graves will be opened, and physically every child of God will be resurrected to physical immortality. But as it pertains to the spirit and the life or the soul, the powers of the future have invaded the present. The resurrection of the spirit and the resurrection of the soul is here, and it is now. And so we can lay our lives down in suffering for the sake of Christ willingly, rather than having them dragged bitterly out of our hands inevitably. And in so doing, we can take them up again in immortality. We can live for the values of that new world, the kingdom of God. We can be armed with the mind of the Holy Ghost to see and to know and to do. We can live in the realms of God's kingdom and of eternity. It is this that the apostle had in mind when he said, "For as much then as Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God." He has ceased to live in a world of unrealness, trying hopelessly to do the hopeless, trying to keep mortality which he cannot keep, and which God in his mercy put an angel at the gate of the garden to keep man from going back to the tree of life, so that he would not live forever in this sinful and inferior state. He has ceased trying to do that, and he has deliberately given up this life, which he must lose inevitably, in an expression which is sanctified by God and his kingdom and his word, so that he can live for God and his kingdom and his will. This is the grace of God to us through Jesus Christ, his suffering and his death and his resurrection. For life has never been the same since Jesus died, and death has never been the same